that everyone's very critical of everything when they're not doing it, of course.
Well, if you haven't heard of JConcepts, I'm sure you will soon. Today I am talking with Jason Ruona, the president and owner. Jason and his team have been building on their years of RC racing experience, expanding successfully into crawling, drag racing and monster trucks. Jason is very much an RC enthusiast, but also a designer and a businessman. So today, I wanted to talk with Jason about what it takes to design and build for RC, and where he feels the future might take us. We tackle RC tyres and what it is about these rubber donuts that can get drivers so animated. So let's get started. Hi Jason, thank you so much for making the time to talk to me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. As we mentioned, kind of pre-show, it's taken a little while to get it all organized, but we tried to get it put together and we finally got it.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you could make the time. So JConcepts, you've specialized in designing and manufacturing hundreds of RC track racing parts. Now, amongst those items, there's a vast array of racing tires, but you've also been adding crawler tires to that list. So how does the fast world of RC track racing have any connection with the much slower world of crawling?
We started back in about 2009, pretty involved in the crawling scene. It's kind of changed over the years quite a bit. The way the vehicles were. But what we did is initially we used a lot of our experience on the racetrack and, what we knew we could do in the design side of things and just bringing, products to the market and for the crawling vehicles at first. Back then they were 2.2 wheels, wheel diameter size. And, over time, we started kind of moving towards the 1.9s or the industry. The thing kind of went through this evolution. And
Right.
but yeah, we used our racing experience and what we know about the different compounds and the way that they perform and the tread and the way it performs, and try to keep them looking unique, but still have a little bit of a scale flair to it. Still, try to provide things that fit into, some of the constraints that we work with the size of the bodies and the size of the wheels that are being used at the time, and then what's accepted if there's any kind of rules.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't race myself. I only have RC crawlers. So my experience with tires is to try and find the right tire suited for my local terrain. And then maybe if the option is available, choose between two different compounds if I'm lucky. But I believe that you offer the off-road racer a few more choices than that.
Yeah, because when we, I always say a lot of what I learned in RC was in the 90s, because that's when, also I guess I was much younger, but a lot of time to experiment and try things on the track. And we go through such a vast array of surfaces throughout a day in racing, because in the old days, they used to either prep the track the day before or at night. They would do a lot of work. It would be fresh. It would be usually wet. And then it goes through a kind of a change throughout the day, depending on the weather. If it's warm, it dries out, it changes. And all these things kind of taught us that the tire changes during all these conditions. And when you're dealing with speed, like in the racing, in the scale side of the game as well, or crawling, but really the tires are responsible for so much of the performance of the vehicle. I would say driving is the number one thing in RC racing, and then the tires are number two.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get away from either of those two things. They're a massive impact on the thing. So what we learned back then, specifically what I learned, was kind of the demands of the different conditions, traveling around, doing a lot of different tracks and races. And then as many years later got into the business and through my racing experience, kind of knew that we needed X amount of compounds to compete throughout a day. And then tread patterns change also depending on the type of track that we're on at the time. And when it comes to we can change tires fairly quick in our game. And when it's about speed, we can change just front tires on, say, a two-wheel drive buggy that we race, and you can go from competitive to being a force to be reckoned with just a small tire change, because it's separated by really less than tenths of a second per lap. So any kind of advantage is always what you're looking for in speed. And the tires do that. They're always an easily adjustable thing. It's easy to change them, try different ones. We glue them. We do a lot of glue on. Well, everything's pretty much glue on in racing, where we glue the tire to the wheel.
Okay.
So we can, we got other sets, you put them on, you go. And that's kind of how it's done on that side. But a lot of what we learned there, it has moved into the crawling and truck game. And it's really been a lot of fun being involved, because personally, I really like trucks. That's why I got into RC in general, because I'm a truck person. Yeah, so it's really a nice compliment for us to be, for me and the company to be involved with the scale trucks, because we're really passionate about those vehicles in general.
Yeah. So, I mean, unlike the off-road races, most crawlers seem to choose between, say, maybe one or two tire patterns that suit them or their truck. And for the most part, they stick with that choice.
Yeah.
So given your experience with the off-road racing scene and your knowledge of tires and tire production, do you see that changing in the future for crawling tires? Do you think?
I think it depends how serious the competition takes it. And that's usually what dictates everything. But based on my experience, the more you can keep that number down, the easier it is for everybody.
Yes.
And since in racing, tires are so critical that we've gone to, like, at our world championships and some national championships, where everybody has to use the same tire because they're so dominant, that it's so dominant in the performance and it takes the options away from the driver, so that the expense doesn't just keep adding up.
Yeah.
So that's something that is done at several events as a control tire, but I could see it. We saw some things getting a little, I'm not going to say out of hand, but things were getting difficult in that 2008, 9, 10 range, because the size of the tires can make such a huge difference. The tread, of course, but the competitor is interested in the best performance. There's going to be a point to where you have to break scale. And, already the tires are really kind of big compared to what, you would see on a real vehicle.
Right.
They're borderline, on some of these class 2 or whatever you want to call it, 1.9 size wheel, but the class 2 type truck. I mean, we're talking about a tire that would be almost 50 inches tall in real life. That's close. That's close to a monster truck tire. So it really, the rules, I think, having rules that kind of keep you in the constraints of what is the whole idea for the class in general is important. And that's kind of what we ran into back in the older days. There wasn't a lot of restrictions, and it was, everyone's like, there'd be a tire that would come out and would just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the tread was changing quite a bit, to the point where it was not only the size of the tire was breaking scale, but now the tread and everything else was breaking scale. And it was just not a very nice looking piece, but it performed amazingly. So there was that performance side and that realism side that really, I think, kind of stunted the growth back then, because it went so crazy. And then then everything started switching to 1.9 wheel size, and everyone trying to rein things back in. So that's, to me, is a little healthier situation. But I think the rules are important, that there is sort of a common ground on you can't go too big, and your tread has to somewhat look kind of realistic.
Yeah.
Now, there's obviously, that's kind of big window, but that's at least for starters, that's something that I think that community will be so much better off if they can adhere to some of those things, because once the ball gets rolling, and it's really hard to slow it down, if it's only about performance, you're going to go down a road that it will no longer look like what people want it to look like anymore.
Exactly, because you have that ability to, do away with the driver seats and, those kind of scale items that you would expect to see on a real vehicle,
Yeah. And I think staying in that range of with the body, and having some of these scale items that are required or dimensional items, it is important.
Yeah,
it is important long term.
No, I can see that. Actually, on that topic, you're just the right person to answer this. Perhaps if you took a full size tire and you scale that down to 1/9, 1/10 scale, does that automatically perform as it does in real life, or would you have to go and change the tread pattern or change the dimensions of the depth of the tread or something like that?
I think what happens is, if I had to guess, in general, I would say the RC tires perform much better than the real tires do by comparison. I think the stuff that the RC tires are capable of is much greater, because they really don't have to be like, I think if you scale down a real tire, like you're saying, perfectly, and then you used a tire rubber or something equivalent to what the real vehicle is, it wouldn't perform very well at all. I think that the reason that these tires perform well in the RC is we make things very kind of soft and pliable. They conform to the terrain like amazingly, more than I think you would get with a real vehicle.
Okay.
And we can get away with all that because we don't have to drive it really at speed, real speed. We don't have air pressure in it. For the most part, we have an insert, where there's no danger of pushing the limits of the tire to where maybe it gets a big crack or a hole in it or something. And you're like, oh, well, I guess that, in RC, you're just like, well, I guess that didn't work, and you just move on to another set of tires. But in the real world, they probably can't do that, or because there's a fear, of then you have the air pressure factor inside. And, I just don't think that, I think that what we're doing in RC is really outperforms the real vehicles.
Okay.
And I think that's kind of the draw to it in general, is I think if we were as limited, or at least in my opinion, if we were as limited as a real vehicle, it would not be near as impressive. I think what we're capable of in RC is actually more impressive than they usually do things a little more than you would think that they're capable of. And I think that's what kind of draws some drivers into it, is that they're maybe a little more capable than what you would imagine. And then everyone's pushing the limit all the time, right? What can I do that I didn't do before? And there's no risks of rollovers and ruining your vehicle. You just go for everything. Whereas in a real vehicle, you have to consider the damage or to your, to the equipment, the tires, the person being inside. So I think if we went straight and just scaled a whole vehicle down in RC, a real vehicle down to RC, I don't think it would perform near as well. So, and I think that includes the tires. So I guess that's the long story short.
Yeah. So you have to sort of modify, you'd have to make some changes to do that.
And I think I've seen that happens in RC, I think, across the board, many instances. And I mean, nothing's more evident in the size of the equipment or the tires at times. What someone might consider as a big tire in the real world, what we're running on some of these vehicles is really much larger.
Yeah, the size, like you say, the size is very different to true scale. I mean, we're nowhere close to like a 35 or a 37.
Yeah,
we're way past that.
Yeah, we're definitely a little much bigger. But that's what gives us that little boost, that little extra performance, more ground clearance. It's like, somebody, in the old days, it was of crawling for us. People would say, oh, this tire is working really well. And then you'd say, okay, what is, they say, well, it's 5 inches tall. And you're like, well, you would think that would definitely be a lot better. You know what I mean? It's like, if you're just talking about ground clearance and all these type of things that hang you up or stop you from proceeding, that's going to be kind of a nice thing to have. Then they would put a ton of weight in them, make them super big, put a ton of weight in them. So then now your overall height isn't as much of a factor. And, pretty soon it's like, yeah, I mean, you're creating a monster here is what you're doing. It's not really a real vehicle anymore. You're just creating this ultimate crawling machine.
Right. Yeah. And I suppose in real life, if you did the reverse, if you scaled up, there would be an expectation that it'd be like, no wonder you can get over sort of rough
Oh, yeah.
terrain. The vehicle's huge. I mean, what wouldn't, it would take something quite immense to stop it, wouldn't it? So.
Yeah, and I think what would happen is it would have these massive tires and you'd have a lot of ground clearance. And then, the tires would be on a real vehicle scale, from RC scaling it up would be really soft. They would be, folding over everywhere, and which is great with the RC truck, but with the real vehicle, that's when I think you could start damaging things. Yeah, I think it's kind of its own animal. I think there's a happy place of it having a performance advantage, being a little bit slightly out of scale. There's a performance advantage to that, which I think has been accepted, or for the most part, and staying where it still kind of looks like a real vehicle, but it's just kind of a little bit on performance enhancement, right? It's like
nothing too radical.
Yeah.
Going back into sort of mid 2000s, I mean, you introduced the Scorpio, which you followed up with the Rupture, and since then you've added the very popular landmines, and now you seem to be picking up pace with more new releases like the Tusk and the Hunk.
Yep.
So what have you learned since introducing those earlier tires, and what are you trying to achieve with the newer designs?
I think what we're trying to achieve is just to have more JConcepts options, because I think there's some people that build for performance and some people build for a look. And I think it's nice to kind of have those bases covered. So if they want performance, they can go down, and they want to stay in the JConcepts lineup, they can be with certain tires. And then if they are looking for more of a look, they can go a different direction and still use our product and be in that and still be in our lineup. So I think that's the idea, is that, that some of the size of the tires, the size of the product, there's some stability there where we can make tires that are similarly sized, but a different tread or a different take on it. And I think that having a little bit of success has been kind of nice for us in the market, because it has allowed us to open up a little bit more and have some different options that I think people or the drivers are accepting more and more all the time.
Right. Not just purely performance based, it's more aesthetics, scale.
Yeah, I think if you go up and down the lineup, I think it could be, you can pick the ones that are the best performing and go down that road, or you can pick ones that maybe it matches a look you're going for. Someone might have a certain look that is in their mind or is in their matches their body or whatever they want to do.
Right.
And I think that kind of enables them to do that.
Yeah. I mean, reading through some of the forums and talking to other crawlers, the landmines are clearly becoming a very popular option. So are you seeing an increase in sales of the landmine tiles? And if so, why do you think that is?
I think there's a lot of reasons. Some of them have to do with getting them ending up in the right hands of drivers or people that influence others. Somebody that has success with the product and a great word of mouth or a way to get the information out there. I think that tire has kind of shown, and the other tire is the Rupture tire. It's shown that when people stumble onto these things that they really like, and then they talk about them, that there is a positive energy that happens with those items. And it opens people's eyes. Whereas I think people in the racing game, the other side of, where we are in racing, people are pretty closed-minded in terms of certain things. Once they get down a road, we'll use drag racing, for instance, another segment we're in, in drag racing, once there becomes something that they feel is the best or it suits their purpose, it's really hard to turn the corner and get them to change how they're feeling about it. And I think that there's a couple things that have worked in our benefit with the landmines, the Ruptures, whatever the tire is I think the customers or whoever were being very experimental and open-minded and giving some of these things a chance. And then when they saw something that they liked, they kind of doubled down on it and said, okay, this is working. Now I'm going to do this, or I'm going to try this. And oh, that's working too. And then they kind of built their vehicle and their program around this tire. And that's what I'm seeing a little bit more. I think everyone was ready for there to be some other options in the market. And I think ours kind of slotted its way in there with some drivers and being experimental. And then they made it work, maybe in certain instances surpassed their expectation. And then they got the word of mouth, which is still seems to be the biggest. And then now when you enter the social media side of things, it spreads really fast. And if a person that's highly influential says this is great, others tend to listen. So we've seen that. And I think that some of it's been a benefit to us there. You know, for everybody, I think in the market, it's hard to control some of these things. Sometimes you're along for the ride, and you try to make something that you like, kind of fits the bill, and you just hope that there is some success stories to it. And then once you kind of break through, there becomes like more of a trust there. And I think that's kind of where we're trying to trend to is develop some more trust that we can make something that's valuable to them.
Yeah. Are you personally involved in many of those designs, Jason?
Yeah. I mean, I think, going back, well, we could go all the way back to the earlier 2000s, but, the landmine, I think we designed, we probably had that designed 2 years before we released it. We weren't quite ready at the time to have that particular tire, but then we kind of saw a little bit of turning the corner with some of the Scorpios and the Ruptures. We saw some of that doing better. And I think the market is getting bigger too during these times. So a lot of things happen at one time, and then we said, you know what, I think this is the time we're going to go with the landmines. And then once, we saw it in person after you make the mold, and then from there we kind of built on, okay, well, we can kind of make some decisions here based off of how this is working in the general sizing and things that seem to be performing well. So yeah, I'm definitely involved in all of them. As far as doing like the computer designing of them, I did all of them in the beginning, but now we've split it up amongst others in our company because we have so many that we're doing.
Yeah.
Not just, scale trucks, but
for the racing.
Everything. Yeah. So we have so many projects going on at once that not one person does all of them, but it's definitely, it starts really, the product starts with me, where we want to go, what the product is kind of needs to, what does it need to be doing? Where is it, what's the performance need to be like? And so it starts there. It starts with some sketching and some ideas, and then going off of what we've already made and say, okay, so we know that this and this we like, and then we can kind of make modifications. And then we do this a little bit on the racing side. If you feel like you have some good items that are working well, and this is especially important in racing, then you can afford to take more chances with what you want to try. So if you have some, 3 or 4 styles you're sitting on that are working well and they're nice, this is in the racing, then you can go for it a little bit and say, hey, let's just experiment a little. Let's go a little further here and try it a little different. And we've done that on the racing side. And some of the results have been surprising. Some things that we've tried that kind of seemed a little bit out of the box have worked. But that's the flexibility that I think everybody wants to get to, is that you can kind of go for it on some things, and the success doesn't, or, how it works doesn't affect you all that much. When you're starting in something, you could take these huge gambles, but if they don't pay off, it's kind of damaging. Yeah. Whereas if you're much further into the game or the business, you can try to take some bigger swings to see if there's anything out there. So,
and also you're working off a base knowledge of what you have and what you've done to get that to work. So you're building on that same process.
Yeah.
I mean, I was looking through some of your tire descriptions and looking through some manufacturers' descriptions of actually sort of how you construct tires. And I was amazed. There's a whole vocabulary that belongs to tire design and tread pattern. And then once you see what they're actually saying, they're talking about the style of the lug, the shape of the lug, the depth, what's on the base of the tire.
Mhm.
And you start to look at tires very, very differently. And you realize that there's a lot more complexity. I know it sounds silly, but I mean, when you look at a tire, sometimes it's a little knobbly black thing, but you start to realize, oh, that feature, that's angled that way to do this, or, it's very blocky, or there's spacing to clear mud. And you start to see that there's purpose in design. It's still way beyond where I'm at to sort of fully comprehend it. But I suppose, what you're doing is you have that prior knowledge, and you're building on that and working out that, if you open lugs up or something, it might.
Yeah, I write all these press releases and all these descriptions on the product. And yeah, you kind of end up making up some words. You kind of end up, you make up some things to try to describe what's going on, because, and sometimes it gets a little, like, I think maybe a little run on, a little bit too much. But sometimes when you get into it, or when I get into it, there's a lot going on in there. And I think that I've always thought of it like, with some of these, it's like 20 years down the road, I want to be able to read this and say that we had a good description for this item, and it wasn't just, throw like one paragraph together that says, like you're saying, big, round, bumpy thing, and, buy it now, right? Like, that's, you can take all the shortcuts you want in the world and just say, hey, look at the picture. But I think it's nice to have to me, when I look at the website or whatever the case may be, it's nice to have a nice description there. Whether somebody reads it or not, it's nice to have the description, because it kind of lives with that product forever in a way.
Right. What I was trying to sort of, when I was trying to sort of educate myself onto the elements that you go build up a tire, I suppose what I was sort of starting to think was, if you understood the concept behind the design, could you get to a point where you can actually choose a tire by looking at it rather than actually having to drive it?
Yeah. I mean, that's what we learned, I learned in racing is, because we call it watching the track. You watch the track to see what things are happening and what's changing. And then you would match from, practicing, testing, experience, you would match the tire to the condition that you're running. So, it wasn't uncommon to, you're sitting there in your pit spot or pit space, and you take a look at the track and you're like, oh, let me go look at this a little further. You walk up and you look at it and you say, okay, I'm coming up to race in maybe, 10 minutes. This is going to happen. I'm going to make a little bit of a prediction. And then you put on the tire that you think is going to be best at that time. So yeah, that's something that we do a lot in that game. I don't think it's, I'm sure there's a lot of tire changing, with the crawling, but I think a lot of times what's happening in racing is the cars affect the track so much. So just the simple, like the cars turning laps, affects how the track is.
I see what you're saying.
And the speed that they're going, and the wheel speed that they have with the tires on the track affects the track. In the crawling scene, I'm sure the vehicles affect the course, but since you're not really driving at a fast rate of speed, or the tires are like spinning super quickly,
right,
it doesn't get a chance to have a major impact. I'm sure it's making an impact, but probably not at the same rate, because the speed is not the same.
right.
But I think that you can get to the point where, and we do, like you're saying, you're kind of doing it the opposite. You're matching a tread to a condition, or a condition to a tread, by just knowing, from experience. That's something we do a lot.
Right. And that's a good point in the racing side. If you picked in the crawling, if you pick the right tire for the right terrain, it's mortally good to drive all day. It's not like, as you say, in racing, you could have the right tire, but if you're going to race an hour later, that might need to be revisited because the condition the track's been left in. I hadn't really thought about it in that context.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think and probably in crawling, you're probably wanting to select something that you're comfortable with, that, it's gotten me through some tight, it's gotten me through a few pinches here and there where I felt like it performed like either up or past your expectation. You're comfortable with it. And maybe if it wasn't as good as maybe another one was, but on the whole, looking everything at one big picture, you're looking at it as a big picture and you're saying, you know what, this is good 80% of the places I'm driving on this whole course or this whole crawl I'm on. And that's better than being really good in one spot, but not as good everywhere else. So, and that's a racing technique also. That's something we use in the racing side. So that's probably, to me, what I would look at in the crawling a lot is, what is, am I getting the best, A to Z impact with here,
right?
And not just this one section that only makes up a small percentage of the course. I want to be good 80+% of this whole thing. And that's probably the direction. That's the comfort, I think, that a driver's looking for.
Right. So if it's more of a sort of a trail-based event, you might have a higher variety of terrain, whereas, say, in a rock-based event, your tire would be a simpler choice.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask you, is it possible, could you tell us how you actually go about sort of designing, taking or building a tire from the design to the finished product? Is that something you could share, or is there some issues that...
Yeah, I mean, would you end up, you have to have a CAD model, of the item that you're doing.
Right.
There's some rules in terms of designing for these type of molds that you have to have a little bit of knowledge in. That's helpful. There's some people that think that you can make sort of the the unmakeable, right? Like, you can't have things that, come out, go over and come back. You know what I mean? Like, there's certain there's certain rules that you kind of have to adhere to when it comes to molding something.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to have a little bit of knowledge of that, being able to produce the CAD model, knowing the dimensions you want to use, knowing something about the material you're going to use is always helpful, because there are some different sizing. It's very common in plastics. Plastic shrink when you mold plastic parts. There's a little bit of science to that, I guess, which usually the mold maker is the best at knowing some of these things. The designer has to know a decent amount about it. The more, the better. So tires are really no different. You have to create a mold, which usually there consists of, there's a mold base. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to make some of these things. There's different processes, but a lot of it runs inside of a mold base. There's they call them cavities, is what produces basically the outside profile of a tire. That they usually call that a cavity. And then there's a core to the mold that produces what would be the inside.
Okay.
And that was kind of some of the nuts and bolts of how it goes together. There are sometimes there's companies that produce single molds. There's companies that produce multiple molds of the same item. And then the way that they process them, that's a little different across the board. There's some different techniques for molding rubber products that are out there. And I think in one way or another, they've all been used with some success, but that's kind of it. And then it's really the material and the your cycle time of producing the parts has to do with the curing of the material and these different things. So, and things like they don't really, it's not easy to make, you can't make one in a couple seconds. There's there's a kind of a cycle time to it all. You just try to be as efficient as you can, but the material has a lot to do with it. And so that's kind of the process.
Yeah. So you have to sort of balance your design with the physical limitations of the mold, say the depth of the impression, the angles and things like that. So it's a balancing game of putting those parts together.
Yep.
So when you sort of sit down, presumably you have an idea that you're going to take an existing design and develop it to be sort of perhaps more niche or to be perhaps more scale. And then you start looking at tread pattern. What happens in your mind when you sit down? Obviously, you have a target. I mean, it's hard to think of an example, but if you were going to say, design a crawling tire for a granite-based environment,
Yeah.
you must presumably have ideas of what's required. How does your process work?
I think it's a little easier to explain with the racing side of it, but I think there is a time where you're trying to create there's a balance between in the racing, there's a balance between the wear and the performance. It gets pretty complicated because when somebody is new in RC in general, they just think that the softer the tires are, the more traction they always have. Well, there's really a point to where there's a little bit of truth there, but then it starts to reverse. Depending on the track conditions, it changes and it reverses itself. So now you're trying to balance your wear with the speed, because if you're traditionally, if you're trying to build something that will go the distance longer than another tire, it's it's more closed up. It has more weight to it. There's all these kind of negatives that start to arrive into the design that actually makes it perform not as well. So you have to take that into consideration of, how long do we want to run this tire for? Is this a 5-minute tire? Is this a 10, or is it 60 minutes? And that kind of determines,
Wow.
how much tread you really want on it. And then you have to determine, what compounds are you going to using this with? Is this a dry track tire? Is this a wet track tire? So there's so many things. That's kind of where I would start, is what's the need? It's
Okay.
like, are we building a tire for endurance, and the speed isn't quite as necessary as the endurance is? And then you can kind of start heading down a direction of, okay, well, we're going to be a little closer together. We're going to have a little more size. We're going to be a little tighter knit arrangement. We might be more on a little harder compound. So that tells you can do a couple other things with the tread. So that would be like one direction, and then towards another direction, you might say, okay, well, this is going to be for a condition or a surface that is wet and has, like, the dirt is actually going to appear on the tires when you're done, because it is so wet and, like, we would say, like, fluffy. And so now you're going to be a little more open on the tread. Traditionally, a little bit smaller tread designs. The tires don't wear near as much when the track has it's wet or water condition. So you can be a little smaller with the tread. You can be softer compounds. So there's all these things that kind of happen, so that they just kind of, like, they start to blend, or they start to kind of form the product in a way.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
And then there's some creativity along the way that I think, for aesthetics and, maybe that finishing touch or that key feature, or, something that kind of defines it a little bit from either a design or a standpoint, that you're like, to us, we want this key feature because that really defines what this looks like over something else. And we know this key feature also performs a certain way. And then this is also going to kind of tie into our name. You know what I mean? Like, there's all these kind of things that kind of play a factor. So,
Yeah.
and in terms of, and on the crawling side, I think you're always thinking in that side of things, does this resemble something that could maybe look like in the real world? In racing, we're not really concerned about, does it look like anything, because it's really only about the speed, and in that point, the performance. But I think on the scale side of things, you're always kind of asking yourself, either does it look cool, or does it meet someone's expectation of looking kind of real?
Yeah.
And I think those are the two things that really stand out pretty often, are those visual keys. A lot of the side lugging that you see that makes things look better, or actually have performance or characteristics but it ties it together, makes it look correct, makes it look like a real tire. And then the lettering of the tire, is there any detail into the lettering that makes it look more realistic? We look at all that. We've changed how the detail and the patterns we have behind the lettering on the sidewall, because we felt it looked more scale, or it looked more real. We're using dimensions and some names and some acronyms that tie back into something that has to do with the real world.
Yeah.
We have like PST on certain tires, and which we said was performance scaling tire. We kind of, going back to the press releases, sometimes we have made up words, sometimes we have things, and we incorporate those into the tire, because real tires have lettering. They have a lot of dimensional aspects. They have all these different things, and a lot of them don't apply to us. They have like warnings and all kinds of different things, and tire pressures, but so we take away a lot of the little tiny detail, because it's hard to get that far down in size. But we try to incorporate some things that, some sizing, part numbers for us to identify how it looks. Is there a texture behind something, behind a letter, that just makes it look that much more detailed? And so all that becomes, I think, just as important to the kind of the finishing touch on those tires. Really has to do with a lot of those items.
I hadn't thought about that, but I could see that, because it's an identification from the consumer.
Yeah.
And I suppose if you left that tire with the same tread pattern but completely bare on the sidewalls, it might actually sort of it has a toy-like look to it. Whereas by having the scale features, you're actually identifying it as something. I've seen something like that. Like I hadn't thought about it from that aspect. Yeah. So looking forward, I mean, tire technology for RC cars is moving forward. They've got belted RC drag tires. And there's talk of using dual or multiple rubber compounds in race tires. I don't know if that's actually happened or happening. In your opinion, is there something we could expect to see in future designs? And what do you think the future is for RC tires?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of those things exist already. We have certain belted items. I don't think that necessarily apply so much to the scaling world, but I think it's a difficult process. And we're kind of breaking new ground as an industry on the drag racing side of things. Because we're really pushing the limits of what the rear tires can do, and everybody's kind of learning at the same time. I think everyone's taking a shot at what their take on doing things a certain way and what kind of performance that it's going along with it. So that is going to be something chased pretty hard over the next couple of years in that drag racing side of things. There's going to be a lot of chasing going on that side, and we'll see where it goes. I'm not 100% certain that we're going to see the growth of drag racing continue at the same rate that it has. It might have leveled off already, in my opinion. I think what's good about the scale truck scene, it has the potential to have a lot of longevity, which I think is better overall. It might be the most popular genre of RC. It's very possible. I don't know that specifically, but I tend to think that it has a pretty big, massive following already. And I think that the more that we can adhere to some of these, staying kind of true to itself a little bit in terms of the look, like we talked about earlier, I think that's going to be very valuable, to stay a little true to a certain look. And, as far as advancing in tires, I think we're always going to see more, because I think it's the searches I was on for that magical tire. But I think there's a lot of licensing that becomes a factor in terms of the business. There's a lot of licensing that goes on with, does the customer want an exact replica of a real tire, or do they want an RC interpretation of what they think is cool or that works in conjunction with the compounds and stuff that we use? So I think that we're kind of in a little bit of a stalemate there in terms of where the licensing kind of meets RC.
Yes.
And so and I think it could split to the point where there is a crowd that really doesn't care about any of that, the scale aspect of the licensing, you know, uh, does it matter to them that it's a Goodyear or a, whatever,
Mhm.
or there's going to be, to me, there's going to be a segment that prefers that always because they want to make it look exactly like the real thing. And that's
Yeah.
important. And then I think there's going to be a side where to them, they don't care. They've gotten past making it look exactly like their own vehicle and they want it to just resemble scale off-road trucks.
But not be a
But
direct
yeah, but
copy.
not be a direct copy. They're okay with
Yeah.
opening things up a little bit to get maybe a little greater performance or more creativity. People are
Yeah.
very creative with those trucks.
Yes.
Building different things, and 3D printing is so big in that. And
Right.
so I think the creative side of that might lend itself more towards it being not as much like a real vehicle in terms of the licensing and the branding, because for customers and drivers to be more creative, it might actually split away from that a little bit. So I don't know. That's kind of what I see out there when I look at some of the different vehicles. Is I see where somebody they're okay with it not being an identical replica of something. They are starting to move towards creating their own vision of what this vehicle should look like.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's a good side of it. As long as we can stay within those constraints, I think, of still looking somewhat what the intention is.
Yeah.
And then I think there will always be the person that wants the exact replica too, because that's how they get started. They get started, I think, thinking that, man, I just want something that looks like my Blazer or Bronco or whatever. And then they get that, and that's how they get going.
Yeah.
So I think there's always going to be that side of it too. And I think that's where we are, I think, in that business is the differences between those two avenues. I think we'll see a lot more tires as always. We always see a lot of them from a performance standpoint. I think it's going to be hard to make substantial gains. I think we can make small incremental gains on a performance side, without just throwing on, big tires or something and just really breaking the scale, or the way you're adding weight back to it or something. But I think we can make small incremental improvements. It's going to be hard to make massive improvements and still maintain a certain look.
Yes, obviously, true scale is a binding factor in design, and then it could impair. But I think you're right. I mean, when you look at the sort of the recent releases of many RC vehicles, they are far more detailed than they've ever been before. Out of the box, which I think is really nice. I mean, they've got semblance of an interior, the lights, and separate grills, and now we've got sort of a lot of body parts attaching to the Lexan and everything. They really are taking on a different look, aren't they?
Well, what's really kind of funny about all this is, when I first got into RC when I was a kid, the first vehicle I really, really wanted was a Tamiya Bruiser. That was the vehicle that I really, really wanted. I just thought it was the coolest thing because they had made a real truck. That thing has metal everything. It had leaf springs. It had a transmission that you could shift gears with an additional servo. That was an amazing vehicle, and they made that in like the mid 80s. And that was the first, and it has a plastic body, everything bolted to it, roll bars, grills, bumpers. It was the real deal. It was scaling and crawling before there was scaling and crawling. That was it, and a lot of tires and wheels were based off of that vehicle back then, which I think is why we kind of got on this 2.2 inch tangent, because back in those days was because that's what that vehicle, and there was a vehicle called the Blackfoot and all these different vehicles that were using that tire size. But that vehicle is what a lot of people try to recreate in that scale world of making the exact copy. That was it before it all existed. So even today, they take a lot of liberties with the design of these vehicles, the way that the axles or the transmission, they take a lot of liberties, and they still kind of join what's good for RC and what kind of looks scaled together. But, back then, that vehicle, I think they went out of their way to actually make it the most realistic possible. So it's funny because it's those kind of vehicles have been made before, but it kind of goes in cycles. We went away from that, and then we kind of coming back around to that kind of look and the features of bolting all these things to the body and that type of thing. So it's kind of interesting to look at it all. But I think, like I said, I think there might be these two avenues that the thing is that segment is going down. And as long as they're both healthy, we're all happy.
Right.
I mean,
right.
we I like them all. Like I said, I mean, people ask me all the time, what do you think of this? I'm like, I like it. It's RC, like it's, you can nitpick all these things, whether which direction it's going is either healthy or not healthy.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I like them all because they're RC. I mean, that's what I prefer is just RC cars in general. So, I like it all. I mean, I can be at a drag race. I like it, or we do monster trucks. I like monster trucks, the scale trucks. I get into that because I like the vehicles themselves. So
I think they each have their own place, don't they? I mean, I think it's hard not to like a really nicely put together scale vehicle. They look great, but then more sort of purpose driven, a little more robust, a little less prone to braking. There's a place for those too, because you can actually drive that without worrying about it. I mean, everything has its place, doesn't it? It's just finding your sort of your niche in where you want to be and what your comfort level is.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the nice thing about RC. There's a vehicle for every niche almost, isn't there?
especially now.
Yeah.
There was a time when it wasn't as easy to fill your niche, and you had to kind of like say, well, this is kind of like what I'm looking for, and then you would get it. But now it's almost like you can get absolutely almost exactly what you want.
Yeah.
Which is neat.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, again, looking forward, there are new innovations in alternatives to tire foams with products like the anti-foams and the RC crawl foam kits and the ability to mix up different foams and weights and things like that. What are your thoughts on inserts for tires? Or what do you see in the future for building and tuning tire sets?
It seems like it's definitely has not gotten any simpler over the years. I feel like what comes with and what we include with the tires are kind of like a starting point. That's kind of like your ground zero or your neutral setting is. And it's also probably the way you keep the item in a certain price point. If you add too much into the package in terms of specially cut inserts, or they're either machined or they're 3D printed or whatever the case may be, the price would just go kind of out of sight for the whole package combined. And I think so that would be a little bit of a shock, I think, to the crawling world. If as many times as somebody says, I just want it all in one package or all in one kit, they don't necessarily want to pay for that. It's more fun to upgrade it yourself and to make the changes along the way. And you don't mind buying these little things along the way to improve it, but it's also kind of capturing your attention or your imagination along the way. So, it's like everything's in steps. So I think the inserts to me are just one of those items that is, especially we use a lot of beadlock wheels in that side of things, and you can take them apart and you can put in different inserts if you want. And I think it's a part of the community that really likes that side of it, is experimenting inside the tire. And I think that probably will never go away because it's the one thing that you can adjust having to do with the tire. So I think we're just going to see more and more options, because there's always a different take on it. In the time that we're in, where people can do sort of like limited run items to sell, like a 3D printed, or if it's hand cut or hand machined, people will try to do those type of things to just kind of be in the hobby. Like to them, it's fun to create some of these things on their own, try to sell them. But ultimately, if you have something that's very labor intensive, or it's a lot of time to make or build, it's also can be an expensive item, or you don't make any money doing it. So usually what happens in this or in anything is there's a lot of individuals that are really motivated and they want to make some of these things, and then they just like, the whole goal is to just sell something, and then they realize that, well, wait a second, I'm not making any money doing this. Well, why am I even doing it? And so that, I think there's a little in and out of this business because of that. Whereas everybody has all this interest in this excitement and passion. They just want to do it. And then once they do it, they kind of like, and pretty soon get overwhelmed and they're like, wait, I'm not making any money doing this. So why am I even doing it?
Yeah.
And then I'm not even enjoying my hobby anymore because I just turned it into labor. So, and then they're like, well, the heck with that. I'm just going to go back to playing with the stuff because that's what I like. And
Right.
so that's kind of where a lot of these items are, I think, in the crawling thing. And I think there's some inserts that are along that way. And they're expensive items. If it's either got to be machined, or like you said, if it's or 3D printed or one of these type of things, multi-stage components, half molded, half foam insert, half open cell foam insert, half closed cell foam insert, all those things come kind of at a cost. And it's another accessory at the moment that I think the driver is going to want to purchase and they're going to want to work on. It seems like it's a never ending thing. It's like even the one that they might like, then it's like they might start trimming on it or adding to it or making these adjustments, sort of like personal modifications.
Yeah.
And I think, which is kind of a healthy side to it, really. So I just see more. I see more of those type of things, more ideas. And I think it's not that at times, it's not that the bigger manufacturer in the business or the larger ones or the more established ones, it's not that they don't want to make more accessories or more inserts. They realize it's a high cost item and maybe it's not in their best interest at that moment to make the most high priced item because it'll scare people off. The price tag. So I don't know, just kind of throwing some different thoughts or ideas out there of the way I think some of this happens.
But I mean, you run a business as well. So I mean, you have to have that hat on.
Yeah.
For a lot of,
if we make inserts and they're highly detailed and they're machined and all this special kind of stuff, I mean, they're going to be expensive.
Yeah.
And then there's a little bit of a drawback to that. There's also, that everyone will say that'll be what they will dislike about it or the company's decision or whatever the case may be. They'll just say it's overpriced, but they don't really know the whole process either. So I think that all of that is a factor. So I think what you'll see probably from, I'm talking about like maybe the Pro Lines, the JConcepts, these companies that are involved in these things on that level, then they might have to get more creative with the insert to have the performance, but also the price. And I think that's probably what those type of companies focus on because they're held to a little bit of a different standard, I guess.
Okay.
In terms of because then it's distributed worldwide. It's not a direct buy item from a website or something like that. There has to be a wholesale price, and all these things become a factor. So that's what I think you would see if you just told the most capable RC manufacturers or the ones that are the most creative. If you just said, hey, we need the most badass insert, they're going to say, all right, well, we're going to have to be creative in terms of the price and the construction so we can meet the demands of what is their constraints. So but I think we're going to see more of that. We're going to see more of the specialty ones, companies or people make them and they're just direct purchases from them, not through distribution or dealer network or something. And then there'll be probably ones that follow down the road from other manufacturers that are maybe slightly different, but have to meet a price point.
Yeah, no, that would make sense from a business perspective. That has to be a consideration.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure, because we're all driven by price points. I mean, for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Burning question is on crawling tires. How do you stand on venting?
Well, honestly, I just leave that up to the user themselves because I have my theories in terms of how the race tires we have to vent. There's no two ways to it. It has to be vented on the race because they're glued tight. So if you don't vent the tire and you drive it, it expands and then it stays there. Uh-huh. So on the racing side of things, it has to be vented. And I think with the crawlers, I think if there's a little bit of air that moves through some of the beadlock equipment, you probably don't need to vent it. But if it's tight, if it's like, kind of airtight and you can feel it kind of bound up, then I think you really going to have to vent a little bit in order to get that full capability of either the tire or the insert. Otherwise, you're kind of driving on this like balloon, like this
Right.
inflated balloon. So which is what we can't do in racing, because the second you accelerate, they expand and then they stay big and they're all puffed up. You can
Wow.
feel that they're under pressure.
Yeah.
And in crawling, I think if there's some type of leakage through that bead lock system, is probably one of the best, because if you start venting the tire and opening up holes, now you're going to let everything inside the tire, like if you're in the dirt and the mud and all that, especially at a slow speed, then you don't want all that inside the tire either. So you either have to vent where it's going to be as much out of those situations as possible.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can vent the wheel, but everything gets in the wheels too, inside the wheel. Sometimes in racing, we'll vent the sidewall, the inner sidewall. We'll put a hole opposed to each other, I guess, on the sidewall. Sometimes we'll put them on the carcass in the center. But to me, if I was crawling, I would be a little concerned if it was muddy or dirty, that things are going to go into the holes.
Yeah.
And then you're kind of dealing with that being inside there and kind of a little messy.
Right.
So I think initially you can build them probably without venting, drive a little bit, see how they feel. And then you might be able to kind of take a little bit of time and do some venting and just see how it affects it. And I would think that we wouldn't want any pressure per se in there in general, because then you don't necessarily get the advantage of all the flexibility.
Yeah.
Like right. when ours blow up on racing, when you try to push back on the tires, they're so pressurized that you can't do anything, and they wouldn't adhere to the terrain as well. So yeah, I mean, I think you need a little bit, but you probably have to really pay attention also to where it's, if it's getting inside the tire, you don't want, once you start getting stuff in the tires, then they're out of balance, and you know what I mean? Like it, there's all those things, but
yeah. But changing tack a little bit, I also wanted to touch on another subject, is RC car bodies. Again, I know that JConcepts is known for making RC bodies and wings, and that you have hundreds of bodies listed on your website. And again, you cover the spectrum from racing bodies, monster truck, drag racing, crawling. Is this something you did from the start of JConcept?
Yeah, our first two things, our very first product really was, we called it was for a vehicle called the RC10 B4. And so we called it the B4 Illusion Body, was one of our first products. The other product was actually a 4-wheel drive racing car, was our other product, but that was before we got into tires. So we actually had the bodies first. We had a car kit we were selling in sort of a limited volume.
Yeah.
And then we got into the tires and wheels. I personally have always really liked the body side to things. I just like it all. It's kind of changed a little bit over the years. The body to me was always the most fun, because I think, like you said earlier, when you build these cars yourself and then you either paint it or you have somebody paint it and you have the finished product sitting in front of you, it's cool. And the body is a big part of that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I was going to say, it hurts me physically, but like when you went with the crawling, and if you're in rocks and rocky terrain, it really bugs me that they get tore up. Yeah. And because I'm like, I want it to look new all the time. But what I've found is it's actually the opposite, really, in kind of crawling, where everyone puts sort of that's like the stamp of approval almost, or the stamp of like your, progression, is that you kind of put those the road rash on there is the proof that you're using it.
Yeah.
Whereas me is, I like, the racing side of things is, you love it when the body's new and the wing is new and the tires and wheels look new and the car's just looks like a race car. And there's a certain like appreciation that you have for the thing looking in that condition. But, but in a situation where you're in terrain that's rough or sharp or rigid or all these things that really aren't good to the body, you're going to have issues. Like it's not going to look like that all the time.
No.
And that's what kind of bugs me about that side of it, is it's hard to have that race look that I'm accustomed to, because really the part of that is the damage. It's kind of part of the vehicle. But yeah, I really like the body side to it. It's probably almost, or used to, at least used to be my favorite, the body side. And I like it even more when there's many options for the same vehicle, because to me, the ultimate is when you see either the customers or the drivers or whatever, and when they're using these items, everybody's a little bit different. It's a little personalized to them. So that's what the further you go along in racing, the more everyone leans on whatever one they think is the best. It's the fastest, the whatever, the best aero for the whatever, the car or the condition they're running on. That's the one everyone gravitates towards. But in other things, and that's the thing with I guess with the crawling, is you can have a little bit of a different identity. And sure, there's a performance aspect to it as well, the way it, crashes or flips, or the way it, the clearance for the tires. And there's all these performance things too, but I have seen it much more open and a little bit more, the individual can still decide what they want to do based off of what their preference is.
Yeah.
In racing, everything always gravitates towards whatever the best one is performance wise. That's the one that everyone gravitates towards using exclusively. So what you end up with is a whole slew of people racing that their vehicle almost looks the same, which to me, it's not as attractive. I like when there are some different styles, there are some different looks, but that's just the way it goes.
Yeah, I know what you mean. In some respects, it shows that the design concept is true, though. If different designers all end up at the same result, everyone's moving in the right direction. It'd be odd to have someone nice to have a unique shape, but obviously you're constrained by performance.
I think a lot of these things are the most successful when a lot of these genres are the most successful when there are options that can be used across the board that are different. The more it gravitates towards only using one option, I think it makes it a little stale. And I think that's ultimately one of the things that causes a little bit of lost interest. It's like, they all look the same now. It's like, it's not as much fun for me. I wanted it to be like this, and now everybody's telling me I can't have it like that because it's not as fast. So now it's like, what, I got into this because I wanted a Ford Mustang, but now I don't have anything close to a Ford Mustang, and everyone's telling me I can't use it because it's not fast. And now I'm just kind of disappointed, that happens.
Yeah.
And so I wish it wasn't as much like that. It's better for the business, I think, when it's a little more carefree.
Right. But then it's exactly that same split that you mentioned earlier about scale to sort of that balancing tipping point between performance and scale. So do you cover the whole process from design to finished product on most of the bodies?
Yeah.
So how does that process start? Could you take us through a process like that?
In the old days, a lot of these body molds were built by hand, sculpting by hand. Over the years, computer generated items, it's kind of evolved more and more towards computer generated shapes, in these items. But I think, we do about half and half. I'd say some of them are shaped by hand. Others are computer drawn items. You got to start there. You got to have it's got to be as nice of a model as you can get for your mold. Eventually you have to go through a couple processes to end up with a hard mold that you can use for vacuum forming. Most of these bodies are all vacuum formed. So you have to have a material that's able to take the heat of the vacuum forming over a period of time. You have to obviously have the right material, the right gauge material that you're using to form the products. Not every one you make is good. That's, nobody ever really thinks about that, because it's like, I don't really know what to compare it to at the moment. But, there's always defects. Nothing is perfect every single time. So there's defective items that you have to deal with. So the whole process of vacuum forming is really, I think, it's kind of cool to me, but I think it's in the world of manufacturing is kind of archaic, but it's still kind of a neat process, but it's very temperamental, and it's still hard to make these things perfect over and over again. There's some that are better at it than others. There's some products that are better than others. It's like we talked about the tires earlier. There's things you can and can't do in terms of the process. You can't overcomplicate the design, because otherwise you can't make it. So you kind of have to know all the constraints and what you can do. And a lot of times, the parts are made so that they can be made in that process. So that's why if something doesn't look necessarily like it has all the detail like a real body has, it's because that it can't be made with the process.
Right.
There's
That
certain,
process won't capture it, sort of.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's you wouldn't be able to produce it. So you have to take some concessions depending on the product at times, just so it can be made. When you get with some of these plastic bodies, injection molded bodies, you can usually create all these details in an injection molded body because they can make a complicated mold that slides and moves around, that you can create all these undercuts and different details in the body. And then they're multi-piece. Sometimes
Yes.
there's a cab and a bed, or you bolt them together, or they don't put the grill in it, the grill's a separate part, and then that bolts to the so they can kind of work around all these things with an injection molded type body process. But the vacuum forming is a little more simple, a little more straightforward in terms of what you can and can't get. And so that's really it. I mean, it's still an expensive process before you can make one part.
Right.
So all these things they're very timely, take a lot of time, a lot of finishing time, and then to get to that final piece or final product is a certain amount of time. And then you have decals, if you have to consider decals, packaging, and there's a lot of other things. So it's really a long process, to make something nice start to finish. Then you have to decide if it needs to be pre-cut. That's a whole nother thing that is really complicated or can be complicated. So lots of little considerations.
Yeah. Now, you were one of the early manufacturers. You came out with the body, the Creeper, which is very much like a sort of a comp crawling design. How did that design come about?
Well, we had a body called the Bog Hog, which was a mud truck. In the real world, there's a truck called the Bog Hog, and it's a mega truck. And we had this body, and we saw a few drivers starting to use it on a crawling truck. So we were like, you know what? This works well. The sizing is about right. And so we kind of took a shot at making that as a sort of a comp type crawler body. What you never really know going into any of this is, are people going to accept that it can only be a certain width? What level in the business or the hobby are they in? If you buy a Traxxas TRX4, they have these big side guards, there's servos mounted out there, there's all kinds of different things. And then you get into these other vehicles, they're wide, they use a wide platform to mount things. And this body was pretty narrow, and in order for us to mount it to a kit vehicle, we had to take the side guards off and do different things with the electronics and put it on the chassis. And I think there was several people at our place that were like, this isn't going to work, but we tried it, and it has been a successful body for us. Drivers like it. And I think they really like cutting it up. they I think I see so many out there just trimmed custom to their liking. There's several of them that I really like the way it's trimmed and cut and mounted, really especially for their vehicle, which I think is kind of neat.
Yeah. You forget that you have to think retroactively as to what it's going to go on and where all those components are going to fit and how that. And if you're trying to make a statement about making it narrow, then things have to move, which not everyone's comfort level.
Yeah, and it's tough because you can get burned both ways. We've made things where that fits a certain vehicle, and we think it's sitting over the tires an appropriate amount and looks the right width and all this type of thing. And then everyone says it looks ugly and doesn't look right, and it's too wide or it's too narrow, or, that everyone's very critical of everything when they're not doing it, of course. But it's like, hey, this is, we're over the tires. We had to go over the side guards. We had to go over the tires a certain amount. Every wheel's got different offsets. We couldn't make it just for your vehicle only. We kind of made it for a selection of different things. And then it's a learning process. It's very difficult to please everyone. The Creep has been really a pleasant surprise for us. And I think that it's kind of worked hand in hand with some of the landmine tires, the tusks, all these different things that I think really kind of match the body pretty well. They look cool together. And then the modified chassis that people and drivers are doing, I think they're kind of working together, which I think is kind of part of the plan.
Yeah.
Well, it is part of the plan. You just hope that it works.
Right. Now, looking at the competitive crawling market, the soccer based events,
Mm-hmm.
there's a real need. You get scale points for having hard bodies, and there aren't too many people in that market. Would it not be possible to say swap out a sheet of Lexan for styrene and do a vacuum formed hard body, or is that just not something that can be done?
Well, the hard bodies that I'm accustomed to, the way I would want to make it, or the way, like, just say, whoever, a Proline, a Horizon, or whoever wanted to make it, is you want to make it injection molded, which is like an ABS or a sort of an industrial kind of plastic.
Right.
Tamiya, I think they use ABS style plastics, but today there's a lot more options or different durability options. But we're talking about, I think, two incredibly different processes to create the ideal injection molded body. And I don't think it necessarily would be possible to create like a styrene formed body. I don't think it would come out or work the way people would think it would. I think that might be a better material for like hand cutting and fabricating and building something, but I don't know that it's exactly a formable style material. And then getting items off of a mold, and having the whole idea of the injection style mold, in my opinion, is that you can get all the details you ever wanted by changing things. And like we talked about with the Tamiya style bruiser body, to me that's the ultimate plastic hard body. And we're going to see more of them, I think, over the years. I think there is a little bit of hesitance in some of the manufacturers, because it is probably the most expensive part you could probably make, which I don't think that scares everybody or the big guys as much. But I think what scares anybody there is now you're kind of refocusing from your vacuum form process to this injection molded process. And are you really just killing one for the other? All of a sudden you start chasing the plastic hard body market, but really all you did is you killed your other market in the process. So I think that there is kind of a balance there. Not that that's the determining factor of everything, but I would say that there's a side to that makes sense. And then the sizing, the style, all the accessories to it, I think it makes a really neat project. But again, you're in a situation with a big investment into something, and if you didn't meet the size requirements or the detail requirements, then it might be a waste.
Yeah.
So you're going to see more of them.
Yeah. And I would imagine that the injection molding, the quality, the cost of the mold and the process you've just changed financially is a big commitment.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, just kind of it could probably be 5 or 6 times the amount of the other,
Yeah.
So now all of a sudden, just say, for instance, that you have a $10,000 project, could it become a $50,000 or $60,000 project? And then the price of the product has to reflect that. And it's an accessory, not a kit. So like in a situation where Tamiya is, I mean, I know like a Tamiya where they have a kit, to just say it's the bruiser. It's something they've sold since the 80s. So they've either been using that mold or refurbishing it or whatever since the 80s for that same kit vehicle, not to mention the aftermarkets and the replacements they've been able to do. But if it's just a body alone, and it's not connected to a kit over and over again, you don't really have that side or that main benefit of it. I could see somebody making a vehicle that sells as a kit with a plastic or injection molded body, then they can sell it as an aftermarket piece as well.
Yeah.
And it probably works better that way, because then the price of the body and all that stuff becomes price of the kit. But anyway, I think that's a good point. I think that's part of the hesitance of there not being more of them.
Mm.
But I think we're getting to the point where we are going to see some out there. I know we would like to do one at some point. It is just we have so many things to do and work on that it's just another one of those items.
Recently, obviously, we've got custom printed 3D bodies showing up.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also been some quite expensive carbon fiber hard bodies showing up as well. And so is this an indication that there might be a demand for a slightly higher price mark for an RC body other than the Lexan?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that it's out there. I think that like you said, it's definitely has a place, but you have to hit, what I see is there's a lot of people that also use them not as intended. So they will take and not even put a front end in it, right? Like it won't have a grill, it won't have a front bumper. And then it's like, it's tough because to me, it's like, okay, so we're making a scale truck. We want to make a scale body. We want to make it a hard body because it looks cool and get scale points. But then we're not going to have a grill. We're not going to have a bumper. It's like, what are we really making here? It's like, if you come out with one that has all these attachments and then they either think it's dumb to have all the attachments or they don't use them, then what was the whole idea of doing it in the first place? It's kind of like there. So it's that it still rides that scale and performance side of things where they're like, oh, well, I don't really need the grill. I don't really need the bumper. It just hangs me up or I don't have as much clearance because of that. It's like, all right, well, yeah, so that's an important thing, but is it a scale truck or not? It's like, it's like, I think those are some of the key things, because obviously if we wanted to do one, it would be in that situation where you're like, okay, is this going to be fully outfitted? Does it have grills and bumpers or roll bars or, what all is in this thing? Does it have windows? Like the Tamiya stuff, they bolted in windows, which, I mean, they're awesome, but they're big and heavy when it's done. True. Then you have a heavy body on the highest point of your vehicle when you're trying to thread the needle and not flip. So it's like, all right, well, what do we want here? Do we want what's best for performance, or do we want what looks the coolest? What exactly are we going for? So that's the tough part.
It is. So do you have any predictions as to what could come next in RC body construction? Is there anything new that you think that might come around?
I mean, we'll probably see more of these competition style bodies, I would think. Some more options, and then a little bit more, maybe some dream. What I like to do is kind of like, I don't know what you call, but more of like an imagination based version of a competition vehicle. Like we have a Ford body called the Tuck. It's a so we narrowed the front end, we narrowed the rear end, but kept the kind of the center the same width. And so, so you have some of that tire clearance and some things that are kind of nice to have. But I know those are some of the things that I would like to do, some more of those projects, because I think it's still fun and nice to have these makes and models kind of represented a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think you draw great parallels. I think from a consumer's point of view, everyone's got their ideas of what would sell well and what would be great in the market. And then, from a business perspective, you have to say, well, does that stand up to scrutiny? Is that real? Yeah. Is that worth my investment? Is this a path we want to go down? I mean, it's always interesting to hear the other side of the argument, because, some people don't realize, without knowing true numbers, you might think, well, everyone I know's got one of those. And someone said, yeah, there's only 250 of them out there, so it's not that big a market, and you can't make money to a certain degree. It's problematic, isn't it, from a business perspective when with numbers are small. So
yeah, I mean, we get people that email us or call us all the time, and they're like, you would sell so many of these, and you're just like, well, are you sure? It's like, it's from their perspective, they think it's a home run. And, maybe it could be. Maybe it could be a home run. But are they willing to take that risk? Or knowing what we know, are they willing to take that risk?
Right.
And that's kind of where some of the magic lies in the whole thing, where, let's like, people say, well, I'll guarantee you I'll get 10 of them. It's like, okay, well, we know you like it because this is your idea. You know what I mean? And everyone likes their own ideas. So the fact that you would buy 10 of them doesn't surprise me. But is everybody going to get 10 of them?
Right.
That's the question. That's the $1 million
question.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I
so
think some people are shocked sometimes how small aspects of the market are, when it really boils down to it.
Yeah, it's a small thing. I mean, in general, these cars are made in batches of thousands. They're not made in batches of hundreds of thousands. So if there's a new vehicle on the market, there might be, 4,000 or 5,000 to start. And, you have to start, when you're looking at successful items, if you start with the basics and you say, hey, if we sold one to everybody that bought one of these, it's 5,000. All right. So the reality is not everybody's going to get one.
Right.
So that's the number one, right? It's like, okay, well, how many there from there? It's like, oh, well, maybe it's 10%. It's like, oh, all right, well, do we really like 500? Is that really the greatest thing? So yeah, that's the tough part about this is, and people do contact us that feel like this is much bigger than it really is. They don't know that, there's people that comment on our videos or whatever, and they're just like, the number that they think is out there is like maybe the most successful number of all time. Right. They think like, oh, you're going to sell 1 million of these. It's like, okay, well, nobody's ever sold 1 million of any of these, what I mean? Like, so it's like, you got to know that to begin with.
It's hard to find that information.
It's like, Traxxas might be the most successful or the highest selling manufacturer out there. And they don't do those kind of numbers, I mean?
It's a reality check.
Yeah.
Well, Jason, you've answered all my questions. Is there anything I've missed or you feel that we should have covered?
I don't think so. I mean, just we appreciate everybody obviously for listening and being involved in RC. That's all we can really hope for. We probably do the most amount of events of anybody in the business, and we have our own events on top of attending other events. But the only other way it seems like you can get to the drivers is either in person at the events, on social media, or these type of listening or video type things, which I think usually turn out a little better than talking to people online, because usually it's a little more negative online.
Yes, it can get a little contentious, can't it? Mm-hmm. Now, so talking about social media, how can people find more about you, about JConcepts, and how can they follow you, Jason?
The website, of course, JConcepts.net. That's where a lot of stuff is. We also have a blog, which is accessible from the main page. I think it's at the bottom. There's a link or something. Of course, on Facebook, we do a lot on Facebook on our JConcepts Incorporated page. Same over on Instagram, which I've noticed that Instagram seems to be very huge for the crawling community, it seems, along with YouTube. And we have a YouTube channel, I think, that we've had since 2008. JConcepts Live, I think, is what we use there. And we also have a JConcepts Racing on YouTube, but I think we've moved it all to JConcepts Live because we do a lot of live events. So we try to update absolutely everything every single day. We try not to miss any days, even weekends, but it happens. But yeah, we have all three of those channels that we definitely pay attention, and we try to do certain things on our YouTube channel, which are like event recaps. We call it a vlog on there, where we just kind of talk about events that we've been to.
That can be great. Some of that post-mortem information is wonderful.
What we kind of settled on with our YouTube channel is doing things that we like. We just kind of do what we can do. We go to the races, we can video the events. We try to do recaps of those events, and we try to show some of our own products. We kind of go over my personal favorite vehicles of all time. So we kind of do things that we like to do, whether it gets views or not, just because that's what we feel the most comfortable with.
That's what you're vested in.
Yeah. So
I think you got all bases covered.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I really do appreciate it. I know you're a very busy man.
Of course. Yeah. Just stay in touch, and
I will do.
And check us out on all the media channels, and keep sending in those product suggestions and comments. And we do look at all of it. We see it. So it's good.
Hey, that's great. Okay. Well, I'll say good night to you, Jason. And I hope you have a good evening. And
all right.
We'll catch up soon.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye.
Okay. Well, we certainly covered some ground in this interview. I really enjoyed the different perspectives Jason shares, not only as a designer, but also as an RC enthusiast and a businessman. I think the combination of the perspectives gives us a clearer insight into the issues and the possibilities of manufacturing parts for RCs. As usual, thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to reach out to me with your thoughts or comments, and I will do my best to reply to them all. You can find us at RC Truck Talk on Facebook, Instagram, and Gmail. If you enjoyed this episode, then please recommend us to a friend, and if possible, leave a review. Credits: music by Croanda, audio by Lee Street Studio Production. And again, thank you all for listening, and I hope you can make some time to get a little dirt on those tires.